Hello everyone and welcome to our lesson on how to do intros in extemporaneous speaking. So the question that we'll be working with today, just for example's sake, is does the US have a cost of living crisis? So there's really 6 parts to an intro, as you can see here. You have first your AGD, then your link, then your background, statement of significance, question, and answer. So let's just do it in the logical order for now. We'll just start top down. First up, you have your AGD. This stands for attention getting device. And what you want to accomplish with your AGD is, it's like the hook when you're writing an essay or reading an article. It's what gets you engaged. So a good AGD for our topic, does the US have a cost of living crisis, might be something like a funny joke about how Congress isn't able to get anything done. Or it could also be something, about inflation or the economy. Generally, you want to avoid getting too personal with these, and you don't want to do anything too crude, So good AGD for does the US have a cost of living crisis? We can do something like, recently, the Washington Post asked billionaire Larry Ellison how the US economy was doing. And he said, just great, I just bought my 3rd island. So that's something that's, kind of makes sense, kind of doesn't. And a lot of AGDs are going to be like that. It's just going to be engaging. It's just going to be a little fun. It's just going to be a little quip, something like that. So for AGDs, we're going to just write down engaging hook. The link, we're actually just going to ignore this part for a second and skip over to the background. Now the background, I would argue, is actually the most important part of your speech. In the background, essentially, you're giving information that helps frame the question in the judge's mind and helps give them any relevant information that they'll need for later on in your speech. Good background for a question like this would probably be something like a public opinion poll about how Americans are currently feeling about the state of the economy, as well as perhaps some empirical economic data, such as the most recent inflationary figures or, housing prices. So something along those lines. This is really just relevant info for speech. Now, something you gotta be careful about with backgrounds is it is very easy to just go overtime with them and go rambling on about things that aren't quite relevant to your speech, but are relevant enough that when you're researching and when you're in your hurried extemp mind, you're gonna think, oh, I need to include this. So for instance, does the US have a cost of living crisis? I don't necessarily need to talk about the Trump administration at all. I could literally just talk about maybe a policy or two that he's implemented, but even then, that could potentially be a stretch. I just need to talk about how Americans are feeling and how the economy is operating. So really just information that is relevant to your speech and that helps frame the question in the judge's mind. And at this point, something else you should be trying to accomplish with your background is sort of leading the judge down a path that'll get them to the same answer as you. So for instance, if my data was saying Americans have never had higher wages, they've never been on more family vacations, and they've never been buying more, that makes you think that, Americans don't really care about the cost of living. They're feeling great. We're not in any sort of crisis. And then if I turn around and say, yeah, we're in the middle of a crisis, that doesn't really add up the same way if I said Americans are struggling to pay their rent or economic uncertainty is at all-time highs and things like that. So really frame it in the judge's mind. Skipping back to the link, pretty short, pretty simple. This is just the transition between that awkward, not quite funny, but engaging AGD and your background. So my stupid joke about Larry Ellison, I need to somehow transition that to my background so I can be like, but unfortunately, most Americans don't have the same privileges as Larry Ellison. Indeed, and then I sort of launch into my background. Now, statement of significance. This is really the why we care. So, okay, you've told us the background. We know something's going on, but why does it matter to me, right? Well, the statement of significance is that explanation. So we could say, does the US have a cost of living crisis? We could do something like, given that the average net worth of the average American household is at an all-time low, we could do something like that. So something that sort of pulls the judge in. Very similar to the AGD in the sense that it's engaging, different in the sense that your statement of significance should really be serious, why we should care, what the impact of this will be on, the worst possible trajectory. So just why we care. After the statement of significance, you probably have the easiest part, which is just verbatim restating the question. Now, it might be easy to just get the question memorized, just by repeating it over and over again. Does the US have a cost of living crisis? Does the US have a cost of living crisis? But it really is important that you verbatim restate it here, because what you've been doing is throughout this entire section here, you've been giving the judge information, you've been informing them of what's been going on, and they're starting to develop an opinion in their mind, but they don't quite know the question just yet, unless you went up in the room before your speech were like, would you like to hear my question? Of course, here's my question. So the judge at this point, they're in suspense. You've been keeping them engaged through all 4 of these parts, so when you verbatim state the question, they finally get to hear what you've been building up to, and they finally get to determine that answer you've been trying to lead them to here in their mind. And that's great, because when the judge and you are on the same page on this crisis, like does the US have a cost of living crisis? When you're on that same page, then they're gonna be more inclined to sort of listen to your speech. So just verbatim restate. It's also really important for clarity's sake, because if you verbatim state the question, they're just like, okay, we've been dealing with the background, now we're getting to the real meat of the speech, if that makes sense. We're gonna start getting into the points soon. Then your answer. This is obvious, You've been building up to all of this. You should now have your answer and have your points. Your answer, though, should sort of be structured like a thesis, from history class or lit class. So this will just be, in the case of a question like this, that's a yes or no question, this is just gonna be a yes, no. So I'm gonna answer the question like that, and then because. So then I'm just gonna give my thesis, my reason. Okay, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis because, we've never had, so much inflation or so much uncertainty, or because Americans have never been worth less. Then after this, we get into our 1, our 2, and our 3, and we just state our points, and then you're good to go.